Hello again. Welcome or welcome back. I'm gonna speak in Mandarin for few sentences. 欢迎大家来到我们今天这一个表演策展人的导师，策展人5位国际导师的讲座，公开讲座。那这次Curatoké 这个字就是 curate 加 karaoke， 我自己发明的这样 Curatoké。这一个表演策展人学院是北艺中心今年和国艺会一起首度联合举办的一个策展人才培育跟国际交流的一项计划。那这个计划呢，邀到了6位国际策展人导师，那有1位他临时没办法来台湾，改由线上。那我们用大约10天的课程，然后有许多的工作坊，然后以及让策展人导师跟学员一起看许多的台北艺术节，以及下礼拜亚当的年会的许多节目，然后再加上他们有许多的对话跟小组的讨论的一个方式来进行这样的一个策展人的课程训练。那因为这些导师机会非常难得能够来到台湾，所以我们特别在今天有了这一场公开分享会。那刚刚呢是墨尔本艺术中心的亚太表演艺术3年展 Asia Topa 的 Jeff， 还有布鲁塞尔 Queenstown Festival des Arts 布鲁塞尔艺术节的 Daniel， 然后还有新加坡滨海艺术中心节目总监 Faith， 他们3个人的对谈。那想要请问一下，我们在这里有提供中文跟英文的即时翻译，所以如果各位有需要的话，可以在前台让我们为您服务。We provide English Mandarin simultaneous translation interpretation. So if you need the device, please help yourself. 刚刚我们在上一个阶段的讨论过程当中，因为时间的关系，我们来不及可能让大家有一点问题的交流。We were running out of time in the previous section, so we hope to perhaps open up a little bit moment if you have any questions or comments. 请问有吗 ？Please, any? Otherwise, we continue. Is that okay? Yes, please.
我比较好奇布鲁塞尔的那个就是艺术节，你们现在针对就是亚洲的就是节目，你们会是怎么样的一个规划的一个方向？就是你们还是会比较朝向是针对主题性的一个命题式的一个策划吗？还是说你们会针对就是区域性的一个地区性的文化进行探索？就是我比较好奇是你们接下来的一个策划针对亚洲的节目的一个方向。谢谢。
I don't know where to sit. So maybe just like to say that indeed there's no thematic approach and no geographical focus at Kunst Festival des Arts. Precisely because it's a festival of creation and we try to start from what is emerging from the side of the artists, but also a little bit starting from what I was saying before, knowing the context of Europe and of Brussels, or in general of Europe, and the risk of reproducing their geographical theme that would highlight a more homogenized way of looking at a certain area. So that's why we always start from a specific relation with the artists. And in this sense, so we travel a lot, including in Asia. But it always starts from direct relation with the artists on the one side. So really being in conversation with the artist and then trying to build trust relation and to the desire to present projects. But there's also another way which is very present, has always been very present, which is making conversation with colleagues. So with colleagues that I have here, but also other colleagues as well, is something that happens a lot somehow, because we know as well that you cannot, it's difficult to have, it's super important to be present and to do field research and to explore, to see a lot of shows, but also knowing that the knowledge that you will have about a geographical area that you do not know, it's always limited. And that somehow speaking with colleagues and speaking with other artists that you know already, to know about other artists that you might not know, this is something that we do a lot. So that's the approach that we have sometimes to start doing research. And I think that the activity of curatorship, it's first of all an activity of doing research, spending a lot of time trying to see and to know as much as possible about what you do not know, and then trying to understand where you have the affinity, because as Faith was saying, this part of intuition, it's still very important because you will be the one that needs to defend the work. But this is what we can develop only by knowing the artists. So the first thing, it's really locally exploring and knowing the artists.
Thank you, Danny. 好，那我们接下来欢迎我们第二段的两位策展人，分别是南非 National Arts Festival 的 Lucera 艺术总监 Lucera， 还有我们的老朋友，曼彻斯特国际艺术节以及 Factory International 的创意总监及策展总监 Ki Hong。How do we get started? Perhaps this conversation, I guess, from the previous one till now, we would really like to contextualize somehow curating or curatorial practices in context of working with or for the arts ecosystem, and it means differently or similarly in a very specific context of where each of the mental curators is coming from and how have they, sort of like enacted or invented several different projects in the curatorial context, but also, for example, serving or in dialogue with many other different layers and surroundings, such as the public, institutions, or public funding resources, or specific community members of artists in very specific cities or nations or cultural contexts. And to follow by this, perhaps I would like to invite Lucera first to share with us a bit South Africa and the festival.
Thank you, River. It's really a pleasure and so much learning that's happening for me to be here. And this is the first time I speak to an East Asian audience, so that's also very exciting for me. So as River said, I'm Rusera Sithal. I'm the artistic director of the National Arts Festival, which is based in South Africa in a small town to the south. It's a very small town. It's like 66,000 people. It's a university town. I am based in Johannesburg, which is much bigger. It's like a megalopolis, and I travel at different times of the year to where the festival is. I maybe start as well with speaking a bit about context. And maybe I go in too much kind of basic detail, but I feel like there's not maybe so many opportunities for connection points between Asia and Africa. So if I say things you know or seem too simple, I'm sorry, but I take the risk. So South Africa is, maybe there's similarities with Asia. We're inside, the African continent is very big, very vast, very diverse, multitude of languages and ethnic groups and varying histories. And it's not easy to travel across the context, across the continent. There's some mobility issues, sometimes security issues, and there's not stable or evident funding that exists for this kind of work. Often African colleagues meet in Europe. That's a bit how it has been. And then within the continent, there's quite a good network and kind of movement in West Africa. In this region, they share currency, they share language, and so you can often have kind of programs where you do find regional visitors. Similarly, in East Africa, also share a language, and the center of Africa is maybe a bit more specific. The DRC is a fascinating, massive space, very challenged with security issues, and in itself a very large and diverse space. And Rwanda is a kind of really growing economic power in the space and very influential, but a kind of antagonistic relationship at times between the two. And the Southern Africa, which is where South Africa, the country, is located, also has its own specificity. There's some very stable economies there, like Namibia and Botswana, but we have different, like Angola and Mozambique. It's Portuguese speaking. The rest of the countries in Southern Africa are Anglophone. So there is not, I suppose, comparatively to West and East, there's less ground for kind of regional engagements. And then South Africa is its role in the continent is shifting, but we have a very, I suppose, relatively to the rest of the continent, there's a very well-established art scene. There are public-funded production houses, kind of big institutions that have spaces and theaters and produce artists. There's many festivals. There's many artists, and then South Africa's own very tumultuous political history was artists and artistic voice and protest was really important over those years, in the 70s, particularly the 80s and the 90s. And so the National Arts Festival sits within this. The National Arts Festival, this year we turned 50, so it's a very big festival, an old festival, and we do receive public money, so we receive funds from a municipal level, a provincial level, and a governmental level, a national level, but it is an independent institution, and we also receive funds from public. So there's a lot to negotiate in terms of what the festival's programming and what it needs to speak to in terms of all these different kind of stakeholders and investors in a way. And I think what's maybe similar to what you were saying, Jeff, there's South Africa does have a kind of like aspirations to Western Europe as a kind of reference point for the contemporary arts, and the kind of logic of the ecosystem is a bit maybe echoes of America and the UK a bit, where we talk about a cultural economy, and so there's a lot of kind of justification of programming that is about like what is the economic impact and the success of a show based on ticket sales and audience figures. So that's a bit the kind of dynamic, and then particularly I think which I find quite challenging is within private funding. There is an area of kind of corporate social investment funding, so funding for like the betterment of society, but there's a lot of funding that comes from marketing. So it's about market access and kind of aligning of brand to lifestyle, which can be challenging when one is trying to program works that maybe fall within the space of being a provocation or being challenging. So I have a little video, maybe the one with sound. It's like one of our social media things. It's just a little bit of a texture and a vibe, which I play for you. I think it's like 40 seconds. So I'll just let it go. Just give you a bit of the energy. So that's like one of our social media things, just a little bit of the vibe. But the festival is, it's very big. There's a main festival. Within that, there's a kind of curated aspect, which I think is that's where a lot of the more direct work that I do sits, and where I think a lot of our conversation will sit. But the festival there's a jazz festival and a schools festival and a kind of community festival and a free festival. It's this massive kind of conglomerate of various festivals, and it runs in the winter for 11 days. And just in terms of scale, very quickly, this last year, so the festival has shrunk over the years due to funding, due to the kind of the city itself and what it's able to still carry, which is there's a lot of kind of infrastructural and economic stagnation / decline. But we had 43 venues this year, 300 shows. 33 of those were on the curated program. And the rest are on the fringe. So there's a massive fringe as well. And the fringe festival played a really important role historically during apartheid and kind of anti-apartheid movements, where it was a space where artists would bring protest work. And just in terms of how the laws worked, sorry, it's a little side story, but I think it's very interesting. A work had to be seen before it could be banned. And so artists would bring works to the fringe, and they would typically get kind of 3 performances. So the first one to be seen, the second one the first one to be seen and for it to kind of be flagged, and then the authorities to come in and 2, not 3, and to ban the work. So artists kind of came in knowing this, but it was a platform for dissent. So I think just in terms of, well, before I speak about curation, I think there's something else which is interesting, and maybe it's a little bit different from what others have spoken about, is the festival now does a lot of work in city management and maintenance because we need the city to work. The festival takes over the city, and we occupy. We have a big building which has several venues. There's a 900-seater. There's a few kind of black box spaces. And that's our kind of premier space. But we also convert school halls and churches and a range of different buildings. And so now, what we have started doing over the past year and a half is started to also do work that is about fixing roads and cleaning the streets and recycling. We've developed a project now where we've made bricks, like interlocking bricks out of recycled glass and plastic. And so all of this kind of work, I think it's important to kind of just raise it, because it's become a huge part of what we do. We employ 1,600 people to do this work in a very kind of menial labor way, I must say, which has its own ethical, well, not ethical, but its own issues in terms of just thinking about work. But in our context, it's something that we needed to do. And in a way, it's a kind of like echo of the country in the 80s, where artists and creative people and activists stood up and did the work that needed to be done to transform how those in power are responding and to kind of better our lives. And so similarly, this is kind of happening. In terms of curation, I think we can probably move into a conversational aspect there. But maybe just to say very briefly, I think some of the things that are important to me. So the festival does, I mean, like South African, it's a national arts festival, so there are a lot of South African artists who come, but it is also an international festival, and it's an important space for this kind of international dialogue or presenting international views and perspectives, particularly, I think, also for South Africa, which was boycotted by many countries while it was under apartheid, and does have a kind of lingering internal gaze, and similarly a kind of where I would say other countries on the continent, on the African continent, have a greater awareness and ease of relationship with African counterparts. South Africa sees itself a little bit outside of Africa. So, I think it's important, and this is also maybe a particular curatorial interest that I bring in, is to create space for Pan-African engagement, which is hard because there's intermediate funding and this all of those kind of issues, but that's a particular interest. But within, so I think maybe I'll just make one comment, is within the landscape of the South African arts. So you have this, you know, we have this kind of, there's government funding, and there's also Western European funding or cultural agencies. And both of these come with a kind of soft power or a kind of parameters for funding. So like an American grant that focuses on democracy or freedom of speech, or, you know, so there is access to funding available, but within particular kind of trajectories and thoughts. And then with private funding, so like corporations and companies, it's then, you know, wanting to fund or interested in particular artists or works that are connected to a particular audience. So in a very crass way, like young, Black, urban audience, you know, will support artists that speak in this way. So the kind of space for artists to create is already quite defined if they are, you know, working within, I mean, that's the kind of dominant texture of the system. And so I think what's interesting for me at the National Arts Fest, not interesting, but something that becomes important, is to kind of create possibility for artists, their own inquiry or their own trajectory to emerge and to make space for that. So where they're not having to respond to a particular provocation that's coming from an institution or from a government or from a business. And a lot of that is about, similar to what my colleagues have been saying, following particular artists, having relationships with artists. For, you know, there's a work that we presented this year. I was telling Daniel about it, Selopesa Nokengia Kubetu. It's an artist who I'm really interested in, and it's a work he's been speaking about for 7 years, which kind of triggered in his mind at the time when his father passed away, and he was ready to make it this year, and I've been waiting for him to be ready to make it. So it's this kind of, you know, having the ongoing conversations with artists, being attentive to kind of what they're looking for and what they need, and then being in the position of artistic director of the National Arts Festival, trying to then respond to what they need to be able to follow and make that kind of space, and try to do that in different ways at the National Arts Festival. And some, you know, the festival does have an application system, and a lot of that is because the festival there's a sense of ownership from the arts community of the festival, and then in a context with limited resource, there's also a need and a demand to have a kind of sense and feedback on how it is that artists are selected. So I work with an artistic committee, and there's representation from different disciplines, and so often we have this kind of discussions to, on the one hand, yes, curate works, but on the other hand, also consider representation and to respond to that kind of sense of ownership. I had another line of thought that I just escapes me. It will come back at some point, if not now, later in the conversation. But yeah, I think those are, it came back. And then something so there is this application process and this kind of formal moment, and then there's having conversations with artists on a much longer kind of time span, cultivating and maintaining relationships. But I've also started to work with some of the other agencies and institutions and production houses in the country, and work with like academic institutions, independent spaces. In different ways, we kind of design it as we go to create spaces for artists to experiment or to explore, or maybe with an academic department to conduct research and have discussions in different spaces. So there isn't an immediate way within the National Arts Festival to support research and development and exploration, but working with other partners, all kinds of partners in all kinds of ways, slowly trying to make that possible, where we bring different, we can call it, I mean, there are co-producing partners in some cases. Sometimes it's a less clear partnership, but to create those, to make spaces to allow an artist to have an artistic process and trajectory along the way with different kind of institutions or partners.
I wonder, could you share with us, tell us a little bit more about the idea of festival and artist ownership?
Festival and artist ownership.
Artist ownership, the ownership of the artist related to like how you.
What I was saying about the festival is taking ownership of the the artist taking ownership of the festival.
For example, like, is it the enactment of the artist-run spirit within the festival DNA, or how for example, how the festival has been shaped by the artist community in a way?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's maybe why there is this kind of ownership of the festival, and maybe I unpack a bit what I mean by that. And I think it is because the festival has been running for 50 years, and because, I mean, if you look back, you can see the trajectory of an artist through the festival. So someone like Gregory Makroma or William Kentridge or Peter Dirk Ace, who's a I don't know that he's known very well outside of South Africa, or Stephen Cohen. These are artists who they had like early moments of their careers at the National Arts Festival. So that's one aspect. I think whenever we speak about the festival or when it's spoken about, you can kind of trace back a legacy. And so in this way, it kind of has been a continuous ground. I mean, a challenged ground, but a continuous ground. And then, I think there's also an aspect that is about South Africans and South Africanness. We're a vocal people. and with this kind of... with the history of protests and being outspoken, and that really being very much carried and supported within the artistic community, there is, the possibility to make demands is something that South Africans and South African artists do, which is kind of great. I'm not sure if I answered or, yeah.
Maybe before I kind of jump into kind of specific of Factory International, just to be able to give a context, I'm from Singapore. I don't talk about that I'm from Singapore very often these days. Sometimes I used to say I'm from Hong Kong because I was there for 10 years. And now I'm from Manchester. So I think it's interesting, that kind of trajectory of constant migration and displacement, has also kind of informed very much how I think about curating and how I respond to my environment, to artists that I work with, regardless of which corners of the world they're from. And interestingly also, I think as kind of an Asian person or person of Asian descent, or however you want to talk about it, working in the land of the colonizer, my body is doubly colonized. Working in the land of the colonizer is super interesting. But interestingly, I'm not interested to talk about decolonization because it continues to give a lot of power to the monarchy. So I'm going to talk about that later within the kind of conversation. But I just wanted to kind of place a bit of that in terms of movement of my own trajectory. So Factory International is just kind of born out of the Manchester International Festival that started in 2007. And it's also a very peculiar festival. And, like Kunstner Festival des Arts, it's primarily only new commissions and usually mostly premiering at the festival. But we're less interested to talk about premiering at the festival these days, but really to talk about working with artists to lean into their ambitions. The other thing about the festival is that it's a festival of scale. And I will give a bit of context of mention. I'm going to skip the Talking Heads video. But just to give you, if you've not been to Manchester, it's a very unique city in the sense that it's a city of many firsts, including the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot of mills, factories, depots that became important sites where the artistic projects are located in. So like when Rosero was talking about city management, it's very similar. The festival, in order to make the work, had to bring a lot of infrastructure in these found spaces. And to date, since 2007 to now, a lot of these factories and depots have become very successful kind of commercial venues, event spaces, beer halls, whatever. We drink a lot in Manchester, yeah? So it's interesting because through the festival, it's also revived the city. And if you know a bit of English history, the North has always been forgotten, especially during the days of Margaret Thatcher. The economy is such that, the economic policies is that it's very much focused on the South, and especially in London. And so the North were very much left to fend for themselves. And with the decline of mining industries and factories and so on and so forth, there was long periods of depression, long periods of extreme poverty. And actually, it is still very visible, this kind of poverty, this kind of intense kind of working class communities. So in that sense, the festival was born out of this kind of ambition of the city to, I'm sorry to say, to like, fuck you, London, and kind of create a very different scenario. And I always say this in public, that as Mancunians, we do things differently because we can, because we've always needed to. So in that sense, this kind of ambition came from the city actually, and including this new building that you see in front of you. It's built and owned by the city. For the Manchester International Festival, or for the organization of MIF. And in that sense, it leans into where, as a city who's always had a liberal government, wanted to go. And I think if you know the current UK politics, it's interesting that the cultural secretary is from Manchester, and she will primarily work from the north, which is super unusual for the UK. And as you can see, the context of the site of where we are is we're surrounded by a lot of depots and mills. It's next to the very first railway connection between Manchester and Liverpool. It's called the Pineapple Line, and our building is built in and around these arches. If you know your UK TV series, suddenly the name escapes me, was filmed in these arches, and these arches are lovely toilets in the building right now. But what I wanted to say primarily in this kind of context of this new building is that it it's one of the most significant cultural venue that's recently opened. We only officially opened last October since the Tate Modern. Tate Modern was opened in 2000, and this was opened in 2023. So it's a significant investment by not just the city, but also the government in the United Kingdom. With TPAC, we share the same architectural firm, OMA. TPAC was personally designed by Rem Koolhaas. OMA was designed by Ellen von Loon, who's the former partner. She just left OMA. There are many similarities between us and TPAC. They love to work in the space of transformer buildings. But sometimes, in terms of the difference also is that because our main brief to the architects was to build us a functional warehouse. So it's a massive space. Wrong thing. So it's a massive space. They can see all the transformers. So it's a seating bank of 1,600 seats attached to a massive warehouse. And Rem Koolhaas, when he does a presentation, he likes to do a side elevation, and he sticks a British Airways Boeing 747 plane in it, just to show how big it is. So this is I think we took this before we kind of officially opened. It's a massive warehouse that can be divided into 2 spaces, but we use it in all shapes and forms depending on what the work requires. So we're also very unconventional in the sense that, later I'll talk about it, we don't define disciplines in how we work. There is no interest to talk about art forms. It is really working with artists on all sorts of backgrounds. And of late, we've started to venture into sports and all the other bits in terms of the conversation. So in that sense, this is the main hall that's attached to the warehouse. And in a sense, it provides us the maximum flexibility by which we lean into how artistic thinking is kind of challenged. And through the years of the festival, it's always been about that. It's about the kind of ambition of where the artist want to do, something that Daniel talked about earlier, to really accompany the artist to really develop something quite bold and quite adventurous. And this applies to all sorts of artists, regardless of whether you're emerging, mid-career, or very established artist. So that space is kind of protected for that. This is our main social space. I'll just fly through a lot of this. But I wanted to kind of go back to, don't have to read the details of this. What's interesting for me is that I after this kind of trajectory, from Singapore and then now into the UK, I've kind of landed in an organization whose values and ethos align very closely with my own. The mission of Factory International is very simple. It just says to invent tomorrow together. It's always about future. And we spoke this morning with the curatorial group about speculating futures. And this is also very much defined. It's very much, I consider my own curatorial practice. So it's kind of interesting that, this organization takes the thinking about other possibilities in a very, very concerted way, and something that is done together with all sorts of communities. And the north of England is also the most diverse, one of the most diverse kind of areas. I'll just give a quick video of, what it looks like after our first year. That's about as fancy you're going to get today with the video. The first year was super interesting in a sense that, you know, we came into this building unfinished. We did the festival last year in a half-finished building and tried to navigate construction workers as we're trying to execute the festival. We had to return the venue every day, every night to the construction workers to continue building it. And then when we took over the next morning to continue the festival. So TPAC has this version of the space called Super Theatre. And just to say that our kind of super theatre, we don't call it super theatre, the warehouse, is our de rigueur, is what we do every day, versus the other way around, where all these other spaces that you see most of the Taipei Arts Festival in is what you use every day. So for us, the spaces also don't kind of sit in kind of any specific way, because again, it needs to kind of manifest in a way that what the artist and what the work kind of requires. So I'll quickly kind of move on to other aspects of us as an organization that I feel is kind of important to kind of talk about more, because it's also in the thinking about futures, it's also trying to find other ways by which expression can happen, other ways by which audiences can kind of access content or the artist. So 5 years or 5 years before we actually built the building, we built a virtual factory on Fortnite. So essentially the idea is to create a virtual version of the factory that is to come, but then only inviting artists who work in that kind of Fortnite virtual space to kind of make work in that space in order to kind of speculate, you know, what it could look like when we eventually open the building. So I'll just give you a quick sensibilities of this is what it looks like in Fortnite. And then, you know, the people like... It's very weird looking back at this because some of it, we literally manifested it, so which is kind of bizarre. But the moment we had the building, we kind of retired the Fortnite factory for a wee moment because we were very curious the space of the online in relation to the actual physical space. So we started working very much within the hybrid format as part and parcel of our programming. So we don't have... we have a director of digital, we have a digital team, but the digital team doesn't go on the site to kind of program digital things and then as part of the program. A lot of what the digital team kind of does and develops cuts through the entire organization's kind of programming. So Gabby, who's our digital director, she looks after both the infrastructure of the digital stuff, you know, so the website, social media architecture, all of that, including commissions for digital practice. But then, you know, a lot of what we think about work with artists cuts through all different levels, or how I described it to the curatorial group as realms. in terms of being able to curate space for that. So in a sense, we always start to think about how can we introduce many different ways of allowing different voices to kind of coexist at the same time. So a lot of our website and our social media spaces tend to be less about marketing, weirdly. It's really about creating additional content that sits alongside everything else, so that there is no one-to-one relationship between, say, a commissioned work and then what exists. So for example, what we do is that we constantly have editors in residence who basically take over the website, you know, the kind of writing, the kind of podcasts, so on and so forth, in order to expand the kind of thinking that we're developing with the kind of main program across the year. And so in that sense, it's kind of our way to kind of expand and develop new relationships when it comes to thinking and the idea of curating, of expanded kind of thinking across the organization, and then allowing audiences to kind of intersect with that kind of thinking. So when we had the building, we started to create this series of work called Factory Settings that essentially, it's a very simple kind of AR-based work that you can experience via your phones. And so the first two sets of artists that we commissioned was Jack Sachs and Gareth Pugh. Then Gareth Pugh is a fashion designer, actually, who worked on the costumes for Free Your Mind, our opening show that was based on the Matrix, directed by Danny Boyle, the filmmaker, working with Blue Dance and designed by S. Devlin. So I'm just going to play you a little bit. Oh. 之前那个 there's a video that's supposed to go. Maybe you mouse over that thing. Never mind, it's fine. This is another piece, actually. So this is a collection for trans artists, black trans artists, that are revolutionary. So Daniel's work basically also started to think about the black trans experience that accompanied actually when we did the Free Your Mind, because part of the thinking around that piece of work by the core artist was really that trans experience. As you know, your Matrix films, directed by the Wachowski sisters, you know, it was very important to think about that. So Danielle's commission existed as a new game that she designed in order to experience, to create, to expand on this kind of trans kind of thinking. But she combined the idea of vampires as well as kind of the black trans experience in this kind of gameplay. And she used a format very familiar to some of us who are old enough to remember, Dance Dance Revolution. So that's how you play the game, actually. You have to operate it in this kind of way. We also have a lot of work that connects very directly with communities. So as an organization, different communities are very close to us. So in the sense that we're quite transparent in some ways. So we have what we call neighborhood organizers, or what I term as experts of the everyday, that live in and across the Greater Manchester boroughs. So they're employed as part of the organization, and they inform us actually, you know, in the different towns, you know, what their community is thinking about. Because we don't believe that if you build this building, they will come. The important thing is that how do you build these deep relationships with communities across Greater Manchester and the North? And one of the key things is that these neighborhood organizers have been with us for many, many years. And actually, over time, we started to develop this idea of co-curating with community. So in the sense that even within the space of curating, we invite community folks who may not be, you know, kind of professional curators as such, but we felt that it was important voice to kind of register within the curatorial frame of the organization. So when in the opening year, we did this program called The Welcome. And essentially this 9 days of program across the whole building was curated by 22 people from the community. We worked with them for 2.5 years, essentially to think about curating, to think about artistic practice, to think about, how do you execute this thing across a building like this? So in that sense, actually, what was great was that during the time of the welcome, a lot of the Factory International staff basically, was quite invisible. They were very forefront in terms of delivering this project. But we, as kind of permanent staff, we learned a lot from the community folks because they really started to think in ways that was not part of our usual kind of thinking. So they continually challenge us how we started to think about curating practice, how we think about artists and making work. So this is a quick video of the kind of things that they did. Because they started to kind of work and really maximize every single inch
for us here in Manchester.
Every inch of the building. Including
I'm a Mancunian and I love Manchester so much, but then when I turn around and look at this exhibition, I love it even more. I didn't think that was possible.
In order to just play with it.
I think it's important for programs like the Welcome, so Greater Manchester people can relate to what is on and feel like they would be welcome.
So it was a kind of a critical moment for us.
When people do see it, they're going to realise the vibrancy of the culture, the vibrancy of the welcome that they're going to have here, to know that we have this massive creative space that can house anything in it.
We've had all of these amazing participatory workshops,
visual arts, installations,
within the organisation.
music.
So every year,
it's just so diverse, the range of things on offer.
Within the year,
I didn't imagine that we would have 200 events that would really reach out to every single part of the communities in Manchester. That's what I'm amazed by.
Organisation. We also have 2 forums formally.
It's just so lovely to see
the people
so they who aren't and haven't normally engaged in stuff like this joining us.
They can tell us that how our program is doing or not. They can tell us our price point is too high.
Depiction
they can tell us
of what Manchester's about.
Or whatever. So it's a constant.
Getting people outside of the art to come, draw, have a drink, have that sense of community. That's one of the amazing parts
a
of
rep
Welcome.
from the People's Forum and formerly from the Young People's Forum. They sit on our board.
Some people in the 20s to pensioners don't matter. Like we have just got the length and breadth of Manchester.
Personally, I found that really inspiring. Just connecting with people who I'd never usually come into contact with.
Community is also about bringing people together. What we've done here with the Welcome is bringing people from Barry, from Wigan, creating that family that we are together, where we are unique.
I'm just going to skip this because we're running out of time. So we can talk about this later, but as an organization, as we make work, we also bring the work internationally. Faith took one of our big pieces, Tree of Codes. Actually, after Esplanade, I think we retired that show. So the idea essentially, again, is to think about, as we make work with artists, it's also not to think of towards just a premiere, but to think about what is the afterlife and what is the impact, around the world. So actually to date, we have gone across 6 continents with our works, more than 33 cities, across 1.8 million audiences. And our former director of international always jokes about it that the only place we've not been to is Antarctica. But, who knows? Something might happen. But I just wanted to end a little bit, and we can jump into the conversation river after this. Around some of the guiding principles, I think that also aligns with how I think as a curator, and so only of late we've started to use, post-discipline as a way to navigate what we previously used as multidisciplinary, because multidisciplinary still continue to kind of insist on certain frames of reference when it comes to kind of art making. So we felt that maybe post-discipline could be a way to think about it. Multispatial could be physical or non-physical, could be metaphysical even, because there's a lot of conversations now to kind of think about other types of knowledge systems and spaces that's not defined by the kind of knowledge that we kind of know. And my friends in the earlier session talked about the kind of particular reference of the Western gaze. So a lot of my own practice lean into indigenous communities and thinking. So in that sense, even approaching temporality is neither linear nor circular, but it's kind of a very different way to kind of describe it. You know, the only way I can think about it is a very different cosmology, if you will, to do this. So co-curator is something that we do. So in a sense, you know, like I say, you know, we don't look at art form, we look at kind of events or experience. A lot of it is trial and error, it's kind of playing it. Sometimes I talk about MIF or Factory International as experimentation on steroids, because this is how I've encountered the festival and how I still am working. And it's more and more important to kind of protect the spaces of experimentation and what more at scale. And I think, you know, because we work in a context that we cut through really kind of usual conversations about diversity. So the kind of polytribal, kind of queer family type things is kind of a regular conversation with us within the organization. So maybe I'll stop here and then we can talk about it, because I think it's a lot. I have. Yeah, not in terms of presenting a work in Africa. Next year. Go back to the other holding slide. Well, thank you both. I would like to perhaps pick one layer, inviting each of you to again elaborate further about because actually both of your positioning of the festival and the organization has been quite new and recent. And in this way, I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about, for example, before you arrived at the National Arts Festival, and of course there has been a legacy of the National Arts Festival as the largest interdisciplinary arts festival there, and previously you've been working with Europe, Afro connections with some organizations, and carrying some international exchange project. Like since you arrived, what's your observation for South Africa artist community? For example, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, and also in Makanda, what's your community engagement approach when you took the direction, of the National Arts Festival? And same question for Ki Hong, because it's a new initiative, and then of course when you arrived, and then you also moved to the Manchester, you literally lived there, and then how did you navigate the existing artist community there and build out the relations with them?
Yeah, I mean, I before the National Arts Festival, I worked at Provisha, which is the Swiss Arts Council, and it was the Southern African Regional Office, so worked in the Southern African region, but also up into Sub-Saharan Africa, which is basically the continent except for the north. I think what's specific about that program, I mean, besides the fact that it had a very healthy travel budget, which was great. It had a very clear and even narrow programmatic focus. It was really contemporary arts. I was working particularly in performance, and it was about exchange. And at that time, it doesn't exist anymore, but there was a grant for intercontinental exchange, as well as between the African context and Switzerland. Whereas now moving to the National Arts Festival, it's a much broader community and a much more layered community. so it's very complex and it's quite challenging, to be honest. And when I did start recently. I started in 2020, in January. So I started, and then there was a largely complete live program, and then we had lockdown in South Africa. We had really very strong and kind of all-pervasive lockdowns for a long period of time. So we had to cancel the live festival, but decided to do an online festival. And I think many of us have different variations of this story. So the first 2 years were not live, and it was. And I think the first year we did an online festival. So we did. I can unpack this a little bit later if it makes sense. But we did a festival on the website, and the second year we did live streamed works as the kind of format. And I think that way of landing into the position gave a very particular impact and kind of direction and path for my engagement with the South African arts community. Because the very first acts that we did, and I have a CEO who kind of does the overall running of the organization. She and I both started in January 2020. So immediately our kind of task was to support a sector that was under a real threat. There wasn't, live performance, traveling, all of that got shut down, and there wasn't grants in terms of aid for artists. So if you have a kind of like a gigging culture, if you're a gigging economy, if you're a musician, or all of that just kind of shut down. And artists in South Africa, I mean, typically there's most artists function as freelancers, and so there are very minimal kind of basic grants for unemployment, but they don't service freelancers. So there's a lot of things in place that mean that artists aren't actually very well supported and often living in precarity. So that was really, in a way, the focus of my first year, was how do we continue to, because we get funds for the arts and for artists, how do we continue to disseminate that when we can't do live performance? So it fundamentally shaped my kind of community engagement. And in all kinds of crazy ways, there was in fact a big kind of backlash from particularly the theatre community, who there was some talk on social media about like the National Arts Festival killing theatre because we're taking it online. And but we did it. I mean, I think and this is also, I mean, a little bit parallel to what you're asking, but it's the National Arts Festival is a festival that in many ways it has to read what the artistic community needs and has to be in service. But at the same time, it is a festival, and it does have it as a festival curatorially, and also in how it manifests and occupies space and deals with audiences. It must take a position, and then so these positions, I think, if you have a strong, clear position which you can defend, this is much more powerful and important than trying to kind of service or make everyone happy. And particularly a festival like the National Arts Festival, for the diverse community of artists that South Africa has, that's kind of a bit of an impossibility. I think my role and my kind of curatorial work working with an artistic committee, there is a degree of distance, because I live in Johannesburg, and we're working with artists across the country, and it's a huge country. So a lot of what I have been doing over the past 3 years, so having done a live festival for 3 years, is two things. And the first instance was to rebuild relationship with artists. Because I think the National Arts Festival, it really, before I came, it grew and grew and grew. And it was massive. Like, it was double the size that it is now. And in reaching that kind of scale, it lost the ability to have a kind of relationships and care. I mean, it's still huge. And so there was a lot of, I think, repair work that had to happen with artists, and places for engagement. So being able to hear back from artists and being in conversation with artists rather than kind of putting a position of, here's the application process. This is the date you get the result. This is when you have to give us your marketing material, da, da, da. So that was necessary. And I think we've done that to some extent. So it's maybe nicer and kinder to work with us. It's still a big institution. I mean, I hope so. And the other thing is to work with partners. So to work with other theaters in different parts of the country, to work with independent projects, to work with community art centers. And it's really hard to do that. And often some of these projects then mean it's like a whole new project with a different funding application and different project management and so on. So it becomes a lot of little things to manage. But in this way, there's the possibility to kind of reach deeper into a particular community, working in a particular space, and have the possibility to learn and understand and work within and, you know, alongside the ways that these artists are working in their space. The festival can't do that directly, but we can do that with people who are doing that in their space. And so those are some things that we've done slowly, as and when we have been able to.
I think my process working with artists has not changed, whether it was in Singapore, Hong Kong, or now in Manchester. And in many ways, as an organization, you know, we're first and foremost an international organization. I mean, sometimes we talk about, you know, made in Manchester for the world, you know. And I'm quite familiar with the city, having been going to the festival since 2009. But I wasn't as familiar with, say, Greater Manchester or the North. So one of the first things I did when I landed in the city was to spend a lot of time in Greater Manchester, in and around Greater Manchester in the North. Sometimes just hang out in a pub in like Rochdale, and then just, you know, have a round robin of artists coming and having a pint with me and just talk shop, just to get to know each other, you know. And I think as an organization, we value that kind of transparency and access to us. So I shared with the Curator group this morning that within our artist development kind of thinking, we have particular programs that are related very specifically to supporting and accompanying how artists make work outside of the kind of commissioning process. But we also do a lot of what we call socials. So in a way, now that we have a building, we do something quite regular where like the first Thursday of the month between 5 to like 7:30 p.m., John, myself, you know, some other member of staff will just be around, you know, just come, you know, have a drink, chat, you know, tell us about what you're thinking about your work, whatever. But this has also started to evolve because the artist social became bigger and bigger. It's like every time we do, it's the 200-300 people. It's also facilitated, so it's a big do. So we wanted to do more than just that. So we recently just started 2 more. One is what we call Global Creatives, and this is primarily for people who are new arrivals to the UK or Manchester. There's been a lot of recent immigration for all sorts of reasons. And so we started to do these socials in order to allow them to also meet their community and how to plug in to the scene and so on and so forth. On the back of the recent riots in the UK, we revived our online artist drop-in that we did during the pandemic in order to just give space to artists who don't feel comfortable coming to the city centre because they felt a bit dangerous. So we revived that. We also revived the in-person artist social again. And it's funny that all 3, we had very different sets of people coming through. In the artist drop-ins, suddenly I met a lot of young people who were moving up from London to Manchester in the North. It was very funny, like, you know, just, then like find out about where they are as artists. You know, it's all shapes and forms. There are people who are even working in marketing turning up for these things, and you're having a conversation with them. But what's great is that you also see them offering support to each other. So I have a studio, you want to come and kind of jam with me. So we wanted to create this kind of space where which artists get to meet in a quite a regular fashion. But sometimes curate, sometimes a bit more nuanced, sometimes a bit more loose. But the idea is essentially that the building becomes that civic site where a lot of people can gather for all sorts of reasons. Yeah.
And in this way, could each of you give us some more example in your curation and your festival making, like based on this different approaches or ways of shaping the relation between the artist community and yourself? Like, have you already initiated or created some specific projects or, I don't know, some special work or production or ongoing initiative in order to respond to this festival need and the need of the city and community?
Maybe I'll just use one example just because it's on the top of my head. I mean, we do this on a regular basis because we have a whole department that's called public engagement, and they look at making work with community, but artist-led first and foremost. Everything that we do is always artist-led. So there's a whole department that just focuses on working with all sorts of people. And within that, there's also kind of learning and all of that. So it's a new piece of work. I cannot talk about it because it's already been published, because we're only delivering the exhibition in January 26. Yes, January 26. That's how long we kind of work. Essentially, it's a work by a UK visual artist, Hatain Patel, who's essentially from Manchester or Bolton in specific. And Hatain proposed quite a bonkers project. He wanted to map all sorts of hobbyists across the United Kingdom. These are people who have particular obsessions, all sorts of things. It's from collecting My Little Ponies to nail art to like souped up cars and all of that. So essentially, that piece of work is with 13 different partners across the UK. And it's an exhibition that will move around the entire United Kingdom. It started in London. I think it's still on. It's in Croydon. They took over this old shopping center called Grants, and it's amazingly installed. There's one room, literally there were more than 1,000 My Little Ponies. So his intent is really to celebrate the everyday into something that's kind of quite high art because of his own kind of obsession as a child. You know, he was very obsessed about Spider-Man, for example. So he made his own Spider-Man suit. And all these kind of hobbyists is something that's always at his fingertips. So the idea is to assemble these hobbyists through an open call that we kind of map. But for us, we will focus primarily on Greater Manchester kind of hobbyists because of where Hatain is from. And we will install this as a massive exhibition in our warehouse space. So all these are people's kind of craft work. Hatain is thinking about doing this because he himself is very obsessed about the souped up cars. These are cars that people add like massive speakers and stuff. So the idea is to install one of the piece from a Matchbox car all the way to a rail car hung in our warehouse, and then everything else is kind of in and around it. There's a film that he made that we co-commissioned that really celebrated all these crafts hobbyists. It looks like an amazing feature film, how it looks like a teaser of a feature film, or sometimes it's a kind of a Gucci or Chanel ad, for example. But the idea is to elevate that kind of practice. So it's something that the public engagement team is kind of like, preparing now, because it's a lot of work to kind of do this. And what we want to do also is to get these folks to start to do workshops for the public to learn about these things. The hobbyist we found in Manchester, she's also in a film, who makes these nail art is insane. It's like she can turn nails into cars and things that move on the nails. So she's been doing this for like yongs, and so she would do a workshop for example, as part of a kind of programming. So just one example of a project.
That's also a continuation, like the welcome.
Yeah, in some ways. So it's really also kind of think about that the spaces of curating and artistic practice, while it's led by an artist, is also manifested via that very kind of deep kind of dialogue and manifestation of what this could be.
There's a few examples I want to share, but I try to be quick. I'll see which. But the one was before the National Arts Festival when I worked at Provincia, and where part of what Provincia, the kind of support that it gave was supporting residencies, and there was a Swiss artist who's Brooklyn-born, Jeremy Ned, and he had wanted to come to South Africa for a residency. It's quite standard. Usually they come, do their thing, and then they leave, and then we see if there's something that develops after that. But for this residency, it was very interesting because we really spent a lot of time talking about what he wants to do, and he wanted to do everything, everywhere. There was a huge kind of sense of curiosity and openness. And so we constructed the residency in a kind of very different way than we normally would. And he came in 3 times to South Africa over 2 years. And he first, in the first instance, and this was, I often wish that I had greater possibility to have a kind of dramaturgical input or engagement where there's works that are being developing, and I often don't. But this was interesting because I kind of did, and it was a lot of encouragement to just come. And I was kind of saying, as an artist coming into a totally new context, it's like the first time you come, you see the space. And the second time you come, you can see yourself in the space. And it's really important to kind of create these layers of engagement. So he came for the first time, did a few of the many things he wanted to do. And, out of the several partners we met, he met one group, which is Impilo Mapansula Dance Company. He came back a second time, and then over those 2 years, he came back a third time, and then they developed a collaboration, and they made a very successful work, which has been touring the Ecstatic, and they made a second one, which is how a falling star lit up a purple sky, if I remember the title right. And then the third work they premiered at Daniel's Festival. So that was a very successful collaboration, and it was, I share it because it was really important to just slow down and just take the time. And also the time in between to kind of reflect. Another example is, so again, this kind of really creating a totally separate project to make space for something to emerge was a project called, so this I did while I was at the National Arts Festival, and we created a project called Portals Next, which so it was myself at the National Arts Festival and Kazerne Basel as a partner with Sandro Lunen running that. And I worked also with Boise Tlekwana, who has a space, Tlamagu Chawe. So 2 South African partners, a Swiss partner, and Shankar Venkateswaran from Kerala. And we did this, it was like a residency project over 2 years in 3 spaces. So in Atapadi in Kerala, in Basel and in South Africa, and had artists and programmers and curators come together. In our project proposal, we had a very different description of what we thought we were doing, but over the 2 years, we ended up having really kind of curatorial meetings, to be honest, and the possibility to experience other contexts with all of these variety of lenses. And we had participants from Chile, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Lebanon, Mozambique, and South Africa. And there wasn't any intention or expectation for a work to emerge, but the work Magic Maids, which Faith is taking, it kind of burst through that process. Very early stages, but that's where it grew out of. So that's also that's like a long-winded, very complex project for a particular work to come out. But that is interesting for me because, it was really very open, and we weren't trying to have artists meet or trying to make a work. And then I will tell you about one more, this was just inviting a work, Alapi, which is a Canadian work that I think I was telling you about it, Jeff. it's a theater piece that has very kind of cinematic quality. It comes out of a radio theater project that really involves First Nations people in Canada, which has then so Inuit people have a very specific practice of throat singing, and I believe, according to the International Library of African Music, so those academics have said, so I'll take their word on it. There's only 3 ethnic groups in the world who do it, and one of them is the Xhosa people who are in the Eastern Cape, which is where Makanda is. So it was really interesting. So we invited the work, but then also built this kind of separate program between the Canadian artists and another group of South African artists. So they're a music group, really old Xhosa women who do this practice to have these moments of engagement and sharing, and over a few days. And that was for the possibility for interest and something to grow, and if there was any curiosity. Nothing has come of that. So I think it's also important to share that example because, you create the spaces for things, and sometimes something kind of grows and emerges, and sometimes it doesn't. But you have to continue creating those spaces. But I think the audience responded so profoundly to this Canadian work. I think a lot of what they were speaking about had such resonance in South Africa, both as First Nations people, and First Nations is not such a recognized word in South Africa, but I mean this kind of indigenous peoples. And they had a really fantastic time together because the throat singers from Canada are young women, and they do it a kind of battling format. But in the Eastern Cape and South Africa, they're all older women, and it's very kind of meditative and durational. So yeah, a lot of beautiful moments together, and I think that they shared and received, but there wasn't necessarily something that grew out of that afterwards.
Yeah, I think in a way, this process-oriented practices being enacted in this curatorial whatever agenda is still very necessary, and in a way it plays a very important role to generate whatever it will be, spreading out here and there later, spreading out into currently and in 2 years. We are at perhaps the last few minutes of this section, and we would like to invite some questions if we have any from the audiences. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I volunteer. My name is Johan Flux. I work for On The Move. I'm based in Europe. I have a question for you, Loki. What you describe is a very unique model in terms of venue, construction, infrastructure, programs, flexibility, funding, partnerships, etc. And I'm wondering how far this model you see could grow in Asia and South Asia. Is there room for that model to be built, or do you think only the UK can grow this kind of model, which is, again, we hate Brits for that. So yeah, open question for you.
It's a great question, actually. I think I do want to acknowledge the kind of unique kind of scenarios of the context of Factory International, because like Kunsten, we work with a lot of partners from around the world to co-commission the projects. We can't do everything by ourselves. Resources will always be limited. I think what's important is that, having grown up and worked in Asia for so long, I think what's interesting is that I shared it this morning with the curatorial group. It's the first time I've worked in an organization that's led by artists. I'm an artist. I still am an artist. John McGrath, who's the artistic director, my very close colleague, is also an artist. Whereas before in Singapore and Hong Kong, I've only worked with bureaucrats who are my bosses. So I think that's quite a fundamental difference, I think, because, in an arts organization that's not led by artists, it is challenging. because there will be a lot of other competing agendas. I'm not saying that Factory International, in our context, we don't have competing agendas. We have all the time. One of our major funders is Aviva, who's a financial institution. You know, they give us a chunk of change in order to pay back the city to build the building. But we were also very lucky to find a partner who are also very sympathetic or actually are very interested in what we're doing. They're obsessed about sustainability. And it's something that I'm also looking after for the organization. And it's a very specific ask about transforming the building technologically that will reduce our carbon over time. So it's kind of fascinating conversations I can have with them to really push that kind of conversation. In many ways in Asia, I'm always drawn to a lot of the independent scene, a lot of the individuals or collective of individuals that kind of drive the conversation. And unfortunately, this scene is very challenging, given the current structures, for them to be in place of decision-making in order to drive it in a much larger way. I think River, arriving at TPAC, has done incredible work for Taiwan, I feel. Because without what River is doing, there'll be no Adam, there'll be no cruising, there'll be no Curatoké. There's none of these kinds of assembly. It is in these assemblies that you begin to generate new kind of thinking, and hopefully you want to influence the bureaucrats, the people who make these decisions. Daniel said this before in one of our sessions. It's not to see them as adversaries. Jeff also said this earlier. But how do you kind of work with them to kind of do that kind of transformation? It's very different context, I think. And so I don't have immediate kind of answers, but to say that I strongly believe that actually the independent scene, and behind you there are colleagues from Kyoto Experiment who are also a collective that is doing super interesting things to kind of push the conversation, So we're all navigating with governments, local mayors all the time, And sometimes over my years of working within institutions, both public institutions like the Arts Council to whatever, I've always held on to a very particular Cantonese phrase. And it says, essentially, literal translation is that if you follow a general, you need to know the surname of the general. So which means that whoever your boss is, you need to know all the anxieties of this boss in order to kind of navigate in and around their desires. And actually politicians are very simple at the end of the day. They're only interested in their own hegemony and their forever power. As long as you're able to understand and navigate that, and they let you do what you do. When I was still working in Singapore, I think I was in a luckier time, I think. Faith will agree. Maybe the politicians were less sophisticated, I don't know. Maybe social media was not, all over the place. It was very interesting that I could get away with a lot of things that now I think is very challenging. I will have my minister, at the time, my Minister of Culture call me out all the time, what the fuck is this? Why are you doing this and why? And then I will explain very calmly in ways that he understood, and the project continued. It's also how you kind of navigate some of these things. But they are also just things that you kind of, try to hold on to in order to protect the space for artists that my friends have talked about in the last session. And that's kind of crucially important, And we need more and more of this kind of spaces, to protect this. Because we live in a world now that nuanced conversation is shrinking. On the back of woke culture, on the back of everything, it's very ones and zeros. It's very black and white. There is no space for any conversation because you're either for or against. And this it's going beyond even political ideologies. It's just how, the tech companies and the algorithms are conditioning us to kind of function. And that's a problematic kind of thing. And so we think about this quite a bit. And actually, Gabby and I, we're so not afraid of AI. We love AI because it's just a tool. You know, it's not going to take over the world. It's just very powerful computing speed. It still needs the human being to input data sets. And you can decide a very different data set to kind of put in, you know? So, yeah. Sorry, it's long-winded.
I just wanted to make a kind of closing statement. If you were done with us and you had moved on to questions, I wasn't sure how you were navigating the end, but so I thank you. I just wanted to say something that is quite interesting and that I find interesting looking at kind of younger generation South Africans, but also looking in different parts of the African continent, is that, I mean, as some of my colleagues have said, and what we know, that we are in a time where, and I think moving out of a time in some way, but where we have Western European reference points and kind of aesthetics and this and a language to speak about our arts, I really see a prominence of Asia in Africa, and it's come about very quickly. I think a lot of it is the kind of aggressive export drive of Korea with K-pop and K-everything. No, this is not a critical thing. I'm saying this is what I see. It's what I see everywhere. And also with, for some time, kind of China's influence and investment is a tricky word, but let's call it that, kind of investment in infrastructure on the continent. There's really a lot more, at a very superficial layer, like an awareness that there's this whole world of Asia out there, and tangible aspects of Asian culture that are now really primarily in the hands of younger generation on their mobile phones. And so there's new aesthetics and new curiosity and new directions focusing into the East. And it's really interesting to see, because just a few years ago, just 10 years ago, the gaze was to the West, and it was like entirely to the West. And now it's changed and it's different, and there's a lot of interest in the East. And if I think about like people who are teenagers and in their early 20s, in 10 years, their interests and the kind of lines of exploration and narratives that they're going to be looking at is very different from the kind of emerging curators and artists now in my context. And so this is, I suppose, I just wanted to share this with you. I think that this is an audience of professionals, and so there's not such easy or obvious possibilities for us to find modes of exchange. And I think there is a history of, or like a familiarity of not seeing Africa is quite common. And it's about like erased histories and, and I think we're also coming into habits of being able to identify where there's erasure. There's no Black people, there's no women, there's no queer bodies. Someone wrote this history with big gaps. And when we see that, and so I suppose in some way I'm kind of calling on Asian colleagues to be aware of this in terms of engaging with Africa, because it happens all the time. There's like international platforms, and it's international, but there's no Africans, there's no connection to Africa, and it's hard to make those connections. But I mean, we know in different ways in all of our contexts, there's lots of things that are hard, but we find ways. So if we can kind of, for me, I think if we can, I'm interested in finding ways to reach into this curiosity so that as it grows, it can grow into a place that is kind of built on real experience and real relationships and the possibility to, engage with these curiosities and not only engage with kind of stereotypes or kind of, or the export policy of a particular country. Or I think this is, I'm really excited about this. And so it's really great. I'm so glad you invited me. Thank you for it. And in this particular format that really allows for possibility to engage with these kind of things like curation, our context. So yeah, I look forward to kind of the next 10 to 20 years. I think we have a lot of exchanges that we'll see coming out.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, since I took the direction of the festival last year, I was lucky enough, like in such a short time for preparing the festival, I was able to introduce Robin Olin, first time in Taiwan, and first time in Kula, first time in Asia Pacific region, and it meant quite a lot for me. And then I was like positioning the two works as the festival opening last year, and people were like, "What's going on?" But that actually generated such great opportunities for us to really learn, and then again open up our horizons to re-understand and rethink about, whether it's called global blah 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 or international blah 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 or market blah blah blah. But in this way that, us again that to related to our the other three mentor curators in the previous section about like, the work of curating or curatorial practices is also shaping ways of viewing, reviewing, understand the world. Yeah, it's about the worldview. It's about the performance of the worldview. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for spending so quite much time with us. And once again, thanks to Lucera, Ki-Hong, Jeff, Daniel, and Faith. We are at the, today is Sunday. Okay, oh my God, the three productions, Bangkok Macau, and Pasolini, and one song, Sefini. And then next week we will have Black Lights by Marty Monnier and new commission of Taiwanese artists, Leftover Market by Ping Wen-su. And then we hope to see you around next week in the Adam Gathering program. And then the Curatoké mentor group and participant group will be around as well. Let's keep talking and chatting. Thank you.